results, their implications, and what they tell us about the strength of the electoral process and American democracy in general. With us today is Kerry Haining. He's a professor of political science, professor of African and African American studies, and dean of the social sciences at Duke. Haining researches race and ethnic politics, state and southern politics, and comparative urban politics. Also joining us is Asher Hildebrand. He is an associate professor of the practice at the Stanford School of Public Policy. He served nearly 15 years in congressional offices and on campaigns, and he was formerly chief of staff to US Representative David Price. And we have Adrienne Lenz-Smith. She is an associate professor and associate chair in Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the civil rights movement, Black lives, and modern America. And joining us in a few minutes will be Matt McCorkle. He's a professor of the practice at the Stanford School and director of the Polis Center for Politics. McCorkle was an issues consultant to Democratic political candidates, state governments, and others for more than 25 years. Asher Hildebrand, we'll start with you. There are still unresolved races at the federal level, but what do we know at this point about how Congress looks, and what, if anything, can we infer about the races that have yet to be decided?
So first, thank you to Duke Communications for hosting this briefing, and I want to extend a welcome to all of the journalists visiting here in Durham from around the world, as well as to others tuning in online. There's still a lot we don't know, as you say, Greg. 5 Senate races and a few dozen House races have yet to be called, leaving both chambers still hanging in the balance. But the fact that they are still hanging in the balance tells us much of what we need to know about the outcome, because nobody expected Democrats to have even a chance at maintaining their House majority. And in the last weeks of the campaign, many had confidently predicted Republicans would march to a Senate majority as well. Instead, based on what we know right now, the most probable outcome is that Democrats narrowly maintain control of the Senate, assuming that they carry Arizona and either Nevada or Georgia. Republicans are still likely to win a House majority, though by no means a commanding one, with Democrats winning key bellwether races in North Carolina and elsewhere. Democrats have already flipped 2 governorships in historic fashion, electing the first Black governor of Maryland and the first openly lesbian governor in the nation's history in Massachusetts. They are also fended off Republican challengers in other states, including Michigan and Wisconsin, though could offset that partially with potential losses in Nevada and maybe Oregon. And Democrats have flipped at least 3 state legislative chambers, including both chambers in Michigan for the first time since 1984, compared to 0 for Republicans. There have been highlights for Republicans too, including running away with statewide races in Florida and overperforming in Georgia, North Carolina, even New York State. But to put it another way, so far there have been few, if any, surprises breaking in the direction of Republicans, whereas there have been many surprises breaking in the direction of Democrats. And this outcome flies in the face of 2 rather fundamental laws of American politics. First, that voters tend to punish the party in power in the midterm elections. And second, that when economic concerns predominate in voters' minds, that's bad for incumbents. And so we can talk more about how this happened, sort of what are the major factors behind this sort of stalemate that is probably a good night for Democrats overall. But let me stop there in terms of a broad overview, and we can get into further details later.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll dig in more into that, and when Professor McCorkle joins us, we'll talk a lot more about North Carolina. Now, Kerry Haining, I'd like to move on to you. As you look at the kind of results across the South and you study changing demographics in this country, what kind of leaps out at you? What kind of some of observations that you're taking away on this morning after the election?
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here and being welcome to you. Let me start by saying we did a pre-election panel several weeks ago. And one of the things that actually my colleagues and I said at that time was this midterm was not going to be a typical midterm election. We're brilliant because the results last night show this is not a typical midterm election. For some of the same reasons that it actually spoke about already, that is so-called red wave that should have happened to some degree, didn't. And that's surprising given historic pattern. The party in power has a disadvantage. We have a bad economy. Things are not going well. People feel things are not going well. But the results last night didn't bear out what the historic patterns would suggest. One of the reasons I think is the case is something that we raised in the pre-election panel, is that the issue of abortion seemed to have mattered in terms of who turned out and for whom they voted once they turned out. You look at Kentucky, there was a sort of a bill that sort of protected abortion rights in a state like Kentucky, a southern conservative state. And that's on top of what happened in Kansas prior to that. And also in other parts of the country where abortion rights seem to have mattered in this election, that gave some energy to Democratic leaning voters. Another issue I think that showed up in the election last night, that this issue of democracy being at risk. There appears to be some evidence that voters chose with that in mind. They made their choices with some of those issues in mind, the threats to American democracy writ large. So they made the election somewhat different. Those issues, we thought abortion had been put to rest with the Roe decision way back when. It had been the law of the land and widely accepted, but the Dobbs decision made that an issue in this election. One of the things that jumps out to me about the results last night, looking in the South and outside across the country, more broadly, is that we need to be careful when we talk about a gender gap. So we're going to talk about a gender gap in American election. And that is where women tend to be more democratic in their voting than men. That's true in a broad sense. When we look beneath the broad category of women, you see that it's Black women. That the Black women are the advantage for Democratic candidates if there's a gender advantage. It's not women writ large, it's Black women. For example, in the Beasley race last night, I noticed that Beasley won women by 7% of the vote. She outperformed Bud by 7% in women vote. But if you look at Black women, they were the reason for that. She won Black women 94% to 4%. And Bud actually won white women by 15 percentage points over Beasley. And that's a pattern we see throughout the country, where if there's a gender gap, we need to talk in terms of a race gender gap, race heightened gender gap, and not just a gender gap. There's a race and gender story there, not simply a gender story. And often pundits and observers get it wrong by focusing on women with the exclusion of race. So we can talk in terms of the intersection of race and gender when we look at outcomes. Another issue that bears watching, and I think my colleagues in political science and public policy who study these things need to take a look at this issue. It seems that race has come up again as a factor for candidates in ways that we thought was beginning to disappear. It's certainly true that white voters are more likely to vote for candidates of color than they were, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. That's clear. But it may be some limits to how much support white voters are willing to give Black candidates. If you look at the race in Wisconsin, all right, so the Senate race in Wisconsin, the Senate race here in North Carolina with Beasley and Bud, and in Georgia. You see other Democratic candidates performing better among white voters than those Black candidates on the ticket of the same party. Right, Mandela Barnes underperformed what the governor in that race did in Wisconsin. You find that patterns beginning to emerge again. And we thought that was something in the past. So race is a factor in elections in ways that bears watching and some more analysis. And one final point I raised about the election in general is that the polling, there's lots of damn polls out there and varying quality. And it's important for folks in the media, I think, to be careful about how you report on these polls. In some of these polls, maybe I can speak to this. I got the sense that it looked like some of these polls that were being reported were what I would call push polls, right? These things about what's the most important issue. I mean, I want to know how that question was asked when I see a reporting of those things in the news, so listing of what. And these things they vary by region, they vary by state, sometimes they vary by region within a state, these issues. But the reporting of some of these polls, I find quite interesting, and that bears some analysis and studying of what these polls mean, how good they are, what questions are being asked, and to whom they're being asked, and not just simply reporting some results of it.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that comprehensive overview. There's lots there that I want to follow up on, including the issue of democracy itself being on the ballot. Professor Len Smith, I'd like to come to you on that. As we know, there were hundreds of candidates across the country running while making the explicit claim that the 2020 election was illegitimate, despite the absence of any credible evidence that passed muster in any court. As you look at the results that we know so far, what does that tell you about the belief in our democracy right now and the health of our democracy, especially in a historical context with the ups and downs that it's had over the last 200 years?
Thank you. Hi, y'all, and welcome to Durham. I am a historian, I'm a historian of the 20th century, broadly, United States. I began my career looking specifically at the era of disfranchisement in the American South, sort of the 1890s, when Southern states rewrote their state constitutions in order to push Black voters out, and in pushing out those Black voters, keeping a whole bunch of everyday white people with them, right? And then I sort of followed the Black freedom struggle in the aftermath of that. One of the things that's been interesting to me in looking at the rhetoric of the last, let's say, 4 years or so, 5 if we start with Charlottesville, is the revivification of the kind of rhetoric and tactics in the 20 teens that had been used in the 1890s in order to justify disfranchisement in the first place, which is to say that the language of election fraud, of stolen democracies, of needing to defend the integrity of the ballot with violence if necessary, is the language of white paramilitary groups in a changing South, fighting back against an expansion of multiracial democracy in the 19th century, right? Taking new life in the 21st. I'm a historian. I think nothing should shock me. I argue with my students about how we shouldn't have narratives of progress. And yet even I was taken back because I didn't realize that we could go back to the white supremacy campaigns, right? That brought Jim Crow into being. And yet, not exactly the same thing, right? And things are never exact duplicates of the past, but there is a borrowing of that language, a learning from that strategy to do similar work, which at the end of the day is maintaining political power for a small subset of people, right? And distributing economic resources up to that small set of people who want to hold on to economic power. Right? There shouldn't be as much resonance between the 19th century and the 21st as we see. I find that concerning, I find it upsetting. I think a lot of people do. They might not have the exact language for it that I do because they haven't spent as much time with their brain in the 1890s as I have, but they see it happening. So it's a little bit absurd to talk about high voter turnout when voter turnout was in what, the 50s, right? But for a midterm election, that's high voter turnout. And in higher numbers among young people than a lot of the rhetoric of what we say about Gen Z would have you think. I think that bespeaks concern, right? I think that young people were told that they were supposed to have one vision of a kind of like multiracial American democracy, and then see this like, upsurge of racial nationalism. And they worry about it. That combined, as Carrie Haney said, with the Dobbs decision, another moment where people had to stop and think about how much they'd embraced narratives of progress in terms of rights and kind of like people's control over their own personhood, right? Like I think Dobbs scared a lot of voters who had stopped thinking that their votes mattered. If there's a big takeaway for me, it would be that we are reminded in a way that I hope folks internalize, but I worry that they won't, that democracy isn't just something that happens, right? There's a way that as a product of American exceptionalism, there's this kind of sense that it's just innate, like, of course, we're going to always have democracy because look at us, we're awesome, right? As opposed to our democracy is actually very, very new. We only really tried having it for everyone starting in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And we were told a short less than 50 years later with Shelby versus Holder, like, oh, we don't need the federal government to guarantee people's voting rights anymore. So let's stop that, right? That's when the experiment in protecting a robust democracy ended. So now it is incumbent upon folks to do the work, show up, pay attention and be active in order to make sure that democracy perpetuates. It doesn't just happen. It's not inherent in kind of the American psyche. The question is whether people will be able to maintain the energy to protect it and sort of reasonable knowledge to figure out strategies for protecting it. That's a lot in kind of one go, so I'll wind down. But the other thing that I'll say, which I think y'all as reporters know better than I do, that one of the things that ties into the health of American democracy and that I worry about is the kind of depth of local news and the impoverishment of local reporting. We shouldn't be surprised by many of the outcomes that we've seen, or we are in the process of seeing today and yesterday. And we wouldn't be surprised if there were more on the ground people talking to people in an in-depth and nuanced way that wasn't just kind of like repeating popular wisdom that's produced kind of at this level instead of sort of closer to the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Len Smith, and perfect timing. Professor McIntyre, I've already introduced you before you came into the room. That's perfect timing. So I'd like to come to you and talk a little bit about North Carolina. Republicans gained seats in both chambers of the state legislature, but while they gained a supermajority in the Senate, they appear to be one short in the House. So what does that mean for the next legislative session, the remainder of Governor Roy Cooper's term? How do you see North Carolina shaping up as a result of these elections?
There are going to be a lot of Democratic legislators getting lavish attention from Republicans to desert the Governor Cooper on the veto. Just in general, I think that it was another disappointing night for North Carolina Democrats. If you look at the way the analysis, I quickly blurry-eyed looked at the analysis late last night, and it looked very familiar, the patterns in North Carolina, where Sherry Beasley did not get as strong a support as Biden did in the big cities in North Carolina, the 10 or so that are above 100,000. Strong support, but just slightly below. And in what I focus on, the fringe metropolitan counties near those big city counties, the 28, I call them countrypolitan, Bud did as well or better than Trump did in 20. So Beasley loses by double the margin of Biden. Biden lost by 70,000. Beasley loses by 140,000. So again, a depressing pattern for Democrats being able to find a majority. And that affected the judicial races. In fact, it's polarization all the way down. Very hard to tell the difference between the results in the judicial races and what happened with Beasley. And in the legislature, the Democrats did hold on to the House in the sense that the Republicans are one short of a supermajority status. They did get the supermajority back in the Senate. That's very perilous for Democrats and for Governor Cooper, just one vote. So maybe there's something of a silver lining there. The only silver lining I really know of is the Wally Nickel race in the 13th congressional district. North Carolina the Democrats picked up a congressional seat. Now, to get to the problems with that, because the North Carolina Supreme Court flipped and is now in Republican control, that probably means there will be no redistricting or gerrymandering control. And I think one of the first things you'll see is the Republicans in the legislature move to redraw the congressional districts. And they probably will be able to do that. The federal courts, Supreme Court said we're not fooling with gerrymandering. And now probably the Republican-led state Supreme Court will have that. So that silver lining may go away pretty quick. But it was interesting that Nickel was able to actually pick up a seat. Is that enough?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for those overviews. We're going to open it up to questions now. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can post questions in the Q&A window at any time. And for the benefit of those of you on Zoom, we also have some overseas reporters in the room who are going to be asking questions here. And I see a hand raised, the second row, yeah.
I'm trying to from Hong Kong. I would like to ask, in these elections, some important supporters for Trump, which is supported by Trump, as lost in the elections. Did it mean that the Democrats is using safeguarding democracy as one point is a good idea, and on the other hand, if there's with the loss of those Trump supporters will bring damage to the authority in Trump in the Republican Party.
I'll start with it, and I don't like to quote cable news networks, but this morning MSNBC said that we can explain this election with the 3 Ds of Dobbs deniers, meaning election deniers, and Donald, meaning Donald Trump. And I think that's a helpful framework to start. Kerry has already addressed Dobbs to a degree, and so I'll try to pick up on the other two. First, in terms of Trump, there's no question that this was a bad election for Donald Trump. With the possible exception of Kerry Lake in Arizona, the governor's race there, and possibly Herschel Walker in the Senate race in Georgia, every governor and Senate candidate he endorsed in the 6 main presidential battleground states, or 5, maybe it's the 5 main ones, lost, or it looks like they will appear to lose. Now, other candidates he endorsed in other states won, like J.D. Vance in Ohio, for example. But there are also other cases where he endorsed candidates in the primary in states like Maryland in the governor's race, or New Hampshire in the Senate race, where those candidates really tanked and sunk Republican chances with them. Right, so he had a bad effect on candidate selection on the Republican side. On the other hand, it appears that he was a motivating factor among Democratic voters, and that his presence kind of looming over the election prevented at least some independent and even Republican voters who had voted Democratic in 2018 and 2020 from coming back into the Republican fold in 2022. One of the more striking findings from the national exit polls that I've seen is that 3 out of 10 voters said that their vote for U.S. House was intended as an expression of opposition to Donald Trump, right? And always take exit polls with a grain of salt, but that was a striking finding to me. And so I think that, combined with Ron DeSantis's very strong showing in the Florida governor's race, is probably going to increase pressure among Republican elites to find another standard bearer in 2024. The question is whether their voters will come, right? So that's Trump. I think a little bit distinct from that is this question of democracy and election denial. And my colleague has already very eloquently talked about the history and the context in which we should interpret that today. There too, while there were certainly candidates around the country who won, who were election deniers who won, in those 5 states that might matter most, the 5 states that flipped from Trump in 2016 to Biden in 2020, it looks like almost in every case, the election denier candidate for governor or secretary of state, which are the 2 key offices, is going to lose, again, with the possible exception of Kerry Lake in Arizona. And in some of those cases, that might just be because they were bad candidates, right? But there's also some evidence that voters cared about democracy when they went to the polls in a way that they haven't before. And that President Biden's decision to campaign on the issue, which was very much criticized by many at the time, was actually smart politics, right? And I don't think voters are getting into the sort of mechanical details of election subversion and the specific acts that a Secretary of State might take to subvert democracy. But I think generic appeals to the importance of democracy and the importance of protecting it were effective with voters in a way that many, that the conventional wisdom didn't fully appreciate.
If I might add to that quickly, so I look at the issue of democracy and the January 6th issue and the abortion issue has been connected. That I see that voters are responding to extremism. It wasn't so much about abortion. Abortion rights is one thing, but it was the extreme position that Republicans have taken on abortion since Dobbs and some state legislatures, where we have extreme laws being enacted. I think voters may have responded to extremism in the sense of democracy being a threat, rights and freedoms being at risk that we thought were home won and not to be worried about again. So I think the larger issue is extremism, and I think that'll carry over to 2024.
I think I would also add a slightly less sunny, not that that was sunny, but like a less sunny addendum to that, which is that I don't think that it's something that they're responding to extremism, they're responding to unseemly extremism, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a way in which we can look at the success of DeSantis or someone like presumably Brian Kemp, or even Greg Abbott, and see use of many of the strategies that we're talking about here, right? Really relying on reducing the number of people participating, right, in the democratic process in order to ensure the victory of themselves and their party, but just doing it in a way that works within the rules instead of blowing those rules up, not having a conversation about whether the rules were just or appropriate or fair, right? So, and to quote or to sort of cite The Wire, every academic's favorite TV show, right? It's the difference between Avon Barksdale, who is immoral, and his successor Marlowe, who is amoral. The amorality is terrible. The sort of Trumpian tilt towards totalitarian anarchy is frightening, but that doesn't mean that democracy is fully healthy if the way that people maintain power is just to jettison others out of electoral participation.
I'll just pick up on that comment. You could say that the dilemma for the Republicans now is what to do about Trump. The dilemma for the Democrats is what to do if there is no Trump. Democrats better watch out what happened in Florida as turning a competitive state and turning Latino voters, especially, away from the Democratic Party. That's the trend that I think Democrats, if Democrats have Trump around, there's a formula now for that. And I think that goes to your point about what kind of extremism, but Democrats better consider what happens if there is no Trump in Florida.
Absolutely, thank you all for that. And I'm going to go to a couple of the online questions before we come back to questions from the room. And one of them relates to the point Professor McCauley that you just made. And actually, Hildebrand, and I'm interested in all the panels on this, and it's similar to what you said. The magnitude of advantage for Ron DeSantis in that gubernatorial race, how much emphasis, how much momentum does that give him moving into 2024 relative to what he had yesterday? And actually, Hildebrand, you want to tackle that first, then please do.
I was talking to Mac about this before now, and I think we have to be careful not to over attribute structural trends to the individual success of the success of individual candidates. Right? Florida has been shifting red over the last few election cycles, and DeSantis was riding that wave. He did not cause that wave. On the other hand, if the sort of state of play nationally within the Republican Party is in part a question of, are there viable alternatives to Donald Trump who could appeal to some of the voters who supported Trump while also coalescing other parts of the Republican coalition? there's no question that DeSantis is the first among equals right now in terms of alternatives to Donald Trump, and that this result last night only strengthened his case that to be that.
So I wouldn't over analyze Florida. I mean, one election doesn't make a trend or pattern yet. The trend is certainly there, as actually pointed out, the state trend is red. The Latino vote, let's not just read back on that. The Florida Latino vote is a very diverse vote.
Latino vote is really diverse everywhere.
Right, it's really what Latinos are talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot made going into the election about what would happen on the border of Texas. And I saw polls that had all of the Republicans, I think they were all women candidates on border congressional districts, US House districts winning, and they all lost. Right, and so there was this whole alleged wave of Latino voters in Texas moving to the Republican Party. Certainly the Republican Party has inroads into the Latino vote. But it wasn't the flip and the switch that many had suggested it might be, and I would suggest that's similar in Florida. There were some local things in Florida that have to say, he ran a very good campaign, number one. He ran a brilliant campaign for Florida. There have been massive demographic change, people moving into Florida, helped his case. He had a hurricane that he managed well, a disaster that he managed well. He got good points for how he managed the pandemic in Florida. I mean, he opened up, never closed down, and somehow that worked to his advantage in that particular state, vis-a-vis other states. And so I think Florida is somewhat of an outlier and wouldn't make too much out of the results last night, other than the point that Donald Trump is maybe a little bit standard bearer in 2024.
Sure, thank you. Professor McCall, we had another couple of state questions I wanted to address to you. Were the Republican gains in North Carolina great in the judiciary and in the legislature, greater or less than they expected? And do you think that it means we'll see more bipartisan compromise or less in the state?
Well, the judicial gains were everything the Republicans wanted. They won every race again, almost by the same margin throughout. So the judiciary is now a Republican institution, but clearly in North Carolina. In terms of the legislature, I guess you'd say the Republicans fell short. The problem for the Democrats is the Democrats are on the defensive in the legislature. There was no real talk of expanding, getting closer to, over getting its own majority. Democrats are reduced to trying to stop a supermajority from happening again. So I think it's probably a good night it was a good night for Republicans. They got most of what they wanted. I'm sure they would love to find one more vote, but they will be hunting for that vote in the state house.
Sure.
And they find it. So.
Professor Lance-Smith, I wanted to follow up on the point you have made about the obviously extremely worrying resurgence of white supremacy since the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Do you have any optimism or any sense from the results that what we saw yesterday might dampen that? That it might be more of a return to more of an underground threat that it's always been? Or do you think that in any way the emboldenment over the last decade of the white supremacy movement in the US kind of suffered a setback last night, or do you think that's overly optimistic?
Well, with the caveat that historians are really uncomfortable predicting things. We love hindsight much more than we love foresight. I don't anticipate a strong dampening of that emboldenment, right? Like I am heartened by the amount of concern and reaction and response to that boldness. But I don't see a lot of shame, rethinking, or sense that people need to be overt on the folks who have sort of re-embraced and like loudly articulated white supremacy or racial nationalism. And I think it's important to note that part of that is because it's not simply kind of like the networks of this racial nationalism or sort of intense racial nationalism aren't simply American and don't stop at American borders, that we're looking at the American expression or vernacular expression of a larger global phenomenon, right? And so if, white supremacist or, whatever we want to call them, the racialized right is connecting with folks in Hungary or folks in Russia or what have you, and they're feeding one another kind of sense of entitlement and injury, then that can just kind of develop an energy and an intensity that we on the ground who would like to respond to it are going to be hard pressed to tamp down.
Absolutely.
I think the wild card for the Republicans, though, is the issue of DeSantis versus Trump and what Trump decides to do between now and 2024, which is probably the strongest hope that Democrats have. But I would think you would see now an intense war that Trump will try to engage with DeSantis and maybe screw up some of the plans that otherwise Democrats might not be able to stop. So maybe that is just throw out the wild card factor of Trump versus DeSantis. Might be important to watch.
Absolutely, thanks to you both. Professor Haney, North Carolina related question I'd like to direct to you. And we have somebody that points out that the only Hispanic legislator, Ricky Hurtado, lost his race, and it doesn't appear that any other Hispanic candidates won in the state. Do you have any insight as to why Hispanic candidates failed quite badly in order to change demographics?
I mean, those of that race in particular, why, well, but so demographics are not destined. Right, you can have change in demographics, and we see that throughout the country. But one of the things that surprised me most is the one who watches these races is that the lack of effort on the part of both parties to mobilize that vote, recruit, mobilize, and turn out to vote. You know, so like he was have always been sort of careful of picking for Republicans. They can be both conservative over a lot of issues that Republicans favor. But no one until recently, right, made an effort to go out and mobilize the votes. So part of the issue is assuming that those voters will turn out for you and not asking for the vote or not working hard to get the vote. So that's part of the issue with these demographics. The demographics are not yesterday. It takes good old fashioned campaigning and mobilizing those supporters to come out on election day.
I would just add briefly, Ricky Hurtado ran a very impressive and spirited campaign 2 years ago, went door to door, was helping people with concerns during COVID, really set a model for a lot of organizing in the state. And that made him a pretty big target when redistricting came around. And so they made his district more Republican. He put up a good fight, but couldn't quite finish this one. I think another, in addition to Professor Haney's very good points, another simple answer to the question is just that we need more Latinx and Hispanic candidates, right? There's not been enough of an effort to bring this major, rapidly growing population in North Carolina into the political fold and candidate recruitment by both parties. And so it's not simply that that Latinx candidates are failing or falling short, is that we need more of them, right, to have a larger sample size.
And those voters, right, they're about usually around 3 or 4% of the electorate, not anywhere near where their population in North Carolina. And at some point that's going to change, but right now it's still low.
Thank you all very much. We've got a bunch of hands up in the room. Would you like to go and ask a question?
People with those words that they sound that way, and sometimes I say that they didn't get that. And also Democrats are seem to be outperforming in these elections. So what are those plans?
Well, the Republican, I'll let everybody else, I'll just make this comment. In recent memory, the Republican performance last night was the most epic example I can think of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory that I have seen. It's almost inexplicable that the Republicans did not do better, except for maybe one word, Trump. And Trump is extremist. It really is amazing in terms of, if you look at recent American political history. I'll let everybody else comment. So.
Just very briefly, I do think that the 3 Ds, Dobbs, deniers, Donald gives us a pretty good start to answering that question. One other factor we might mention, which Terry alluded to, which he alluded earlier, is that in the closing weeks of the campaign, the polls were probably overstating Republican support. And that's why, that doesn't explain the outcome, but it explains why we were so surprised by it. In recent cycles, we've seen polls systematically biased towards Democrats. And in this case, it looks like the polls were overcorrected, maybe a little bit, about a point in favor of Republicans. But beyond that, you also saw what appears to be a pretty concerted effort by Republicans to flood the zone by releasing a lot of polls that showed Republicans favored in an effort to influence the polling averages, which are now used by many observers, and to influence the media narrative. And that effort seemed to pay off. The media narrative coming into the election was Republicans are going to march to victory. There will be a red wave or even a red tsunami, right? But that narrative was disconnected from the reality on the ground in many states, which had a lot of Democratic voters with great intensity and enthusiasm, in part because of the Dobbs decision, and which had a lot of independent and some Republican voters. Maybe they weren't fans of Joe Biden, but they were willing to hold their nose and vote for Democrats for Senate or governor because they thought that was better than the alternative.
Good, thank you. We've got a question at the end there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is Shaukat Paracha coming over from Pakistan, sir. But my question is, when we got here a few days back, and we had interaction with different people. We heard chances of violence, people talking about not accepting the poll results or the election laws. As Dr. Saab said that people have given a message to protect the democracy. So how this message from within the United States is going to impact other regions? Because in our region, especially tendency is that they come with hordes of people and they just think to do what President Donald Trump did on 6th of January or his supporters did. Second question is, since Donald Trump himself became part of this process that he was conversing with some of the candidates, his association with the electioneering and the outcome, rather poor outcome for Republican, how it's going to impact his candidature for future presidential elections?
No, I think, as been said earlier, that last night, the win in Florida by DeSantis and the loss of Trump endorsed candidates in another state would have a tremendous impact on Donald Trump's future. Not only that, sometimes on the table too, but in this vein, I think last night may have sped up the clock of a potential indictment for former President Trump, right? That he's now clearly not, the standard bearer, and I think it's some opening now for there may be an indictment of Trump. So that is another factor that is part of the conversation that's yet to be fully revealed. But I don't think it's going away. This issue is going away. I suspect President Biden is on his way abroad. You mentioned what does it mean beyond the shores of this country. I suspect that he will reassure allies and others that see what happened last night, that we have at least not turned the tide, but at least put a barrier, and that democracy is safe in this country, and those results he can point to those results to say so. The January 6th committee is not yet done with this work. I suspect they'll be quickly as depending on how the outcome, the Republicans are likely to win a majority in the House, and this committee will soon go out of business. So they have a couple of months to wrap up. I suspect you'll see some speeding up of their activities along these lines, and there'll be more messages coming out about democracy in January 6th and what happened.
I mean, to put a time on it, I would also just say, there may be an end of Trump, but there won't be an end of Trumpism, right? No matter what sort of comes out of this. And then also we can talk about political violence in terms of mob violence, or we can talk about it also in terms of individualized violence. And let us not forget that we're still days out from a man inspired again by this rhetoric, attacking Nancy Pelosi's husband in an attempt to get to Nancy Pelosi. Like, that is still just floating around and not precisely routine, but more common than I think we would have been able to imagine it several years ago, is again, a lasting point.
And I was just gonna, one ironic good note to some of these split decisions in states is that the election deniers have a problem. For instance, Bo Hines in the 13th congressional district might have been the Republican who lost. You might have thought of him as a classic one who would be an election denier. But since Ted Budd and lots of other Republicans won in the state, he really can't mount an argument against the election results. Same way with, for instance, if Herschel Walker loses in Georgia, since Brian Kemp, the Republican, won going away, and the Republicans control the process in Georgia, it's going to be hard for Herschel Walker to deny elections. Now, where we might see this still blow up is in Arizona, for instance, and maybe in Pennsylvania, where Republicans lost throughout. But when you see these split tickets, that's a nice little ironic light note.
So it assumed logical consistency.
Well, something to add to that, we had an online question about Arizona and the fact that Carrie Lake, win or lose, is already seizing on malfunctioning voting machines as evidence of fraud. Do we think that that will give fresh oxygen to those kind of allegations that people have tried to make fraudulently over the last couple of years? Or do you think these split results in these other states will stop Republicans across the board from supporting the notion of illegitimate elections?
Just briefly, I think that Professor Lynn-Smith's point, that claim does not depend on fresh oxygen, right? It's a pretty evergreen claim among those who seek to use it to their advantage and in the service of their power, that depends neither on logic nor evidence. And that, so in that sense, it's not going to go away. I do feel like we can take some, at least short-term measure of reassurance that more claims have not been made around the country to that effect. And for various reasons, you know, even in cases where it looked pretty dicey, it looked pretty uncertain, like the governor's race in Pennsylvania, you know, we've seen pretty decisive victories. We can also take some measure of reassurance in the fact that the election, by and large, would run very smoothly, right? Despite the fact that we're still in this pandemic, we're still unsure of voting methods. There's been a lot of changes. There were very, very few irregularities nationwide. And so I guess I temper short-term reassurance with still long-term concern that those claims of voter fraud have been with us for nearly all of our history and are not going away anytime soon.
One major factor I think to watch is to see what Majority Leader McConnell and Majority Leader McCarthy, what they do. It's in their interest to tamp this down as well. Looking at those results is, you know, that this is a losing proposition for Republicans going forward, continuing this nonsense about voter fraud in the way that they made it the previous few years. So my guess is you'll see leadership in Congress come out and talk about how fine the election was, because it's in their interest to tamp this down. Even Perry Lake aside, it cannot go forward with this as an issue and a campaign issue for the Republicans. They'll continue to lose. They're getting close to a majority, right? And so they want to win and beat a majority party. And that's not a way forward, I think, if it goes last night show.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to one state-related question online. A number of people have asked it. In fact, I'll start with you and interested in everybody's perspective on this. Do we know yet what the outcome of the election in North Carolina will mean for abortion rights specifically in this state? Because obviously we've had the big legislature switch. There is still barely, it appears, a functioning veto that the governor group has. Is it too soon to say, or what do you expect the legislature to do, if anything, on abortion?
Well, I guess it's too soon to say. I mean, one vote in the House, that's the protection for abortion rights. So and you have to assume that every Democrat would support Governor Cooper's veto. So we need to see. It's very close. The other thing that clearly happened is with the Republican takeover in the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, there will be no state constitutional argument on privacy grounds or protecting abortion, access to abortion from the judiciary. And so it completely revolves around every Democrat in the House staying loyal to upholding veto from Cooper. There could be questions about that.
Professor Haney, there was a lot of talk nationally at the state level coming into this election that whether young voters would mobilise in the numbers that they never traditionally do if the Dobbs and abortion decision would do that. Are there any signs yet of whether we saw higher than usual turnout among young voters in this election?
It's mixed with the data I looked at. There appears to be some evidence the young voters mobilized and turned out in higher numbers than in previous midterm elections. But it's also clear there are a lot of young voters that don't the game. And again, the lack of efforts to mobilize those voters, I think it was stopping part of the Democrats. Where you have an advantage in that demographic, 18 to say 35-year-old, tend to be Democratic leaning voters. And in part because of the issues of, say, abortion, individual rights, environmental issues, issues that are front and center for young voters. The Democrats have not made concerted effort to mobilize voters. That's the most fascinating thing to me watching American elections over the last couple of decades. I watch this as a profession and I'm a political junkie. So I watch TV and all the ads. 2 or 3 weeks ago, if I see one more damn ad, I'm going to break my television. I don't understand why candidates and campaigns spend money for new ads in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign. That money we better spend getting your voters to the poll. I will submit that most voters 2 or 3 weeks out have made up their mind. And the few who haven't, the money that you'll spend trying to get those few be better spent on trying to get the ones you know are going to support you to actually show up and cast them out. But we spend billions of dollars around the country with these ads. And again, I do it as a professional, I like to watch it, but I was ready to break my television if I see another ad. And so I think regular voters may feel the same way. And so it's a lack of effort and concerted effort to turn out these constituents, particularly young people, to reach young people and get them out to the polls. We know it's a hard demographic to get out for various reasons, but the lack of effort to do so is a factor there as well.
These comments also make me think, I understand why Democrats make reproductive justice a Democratic issue, a partisan issue, because it serves them well. But I think one of the ways you can read the way people have voted in states against bills trying to criminalize abortion is that it like Republican women have abortions for a variety of reasons. That people who are actually thinking about this from the standpoint of advocating kind of reproductive rights should resist the language of this is a Democratic issue or this is a Republican issue, and actually think about it as a way to get people to see rights as not adhering to an individual group's interest, but in everything.
Thank you. Professor Langston, I'd like to stay with you for a moment. As you mentioned earlier, you studied disenfranchisement in this country and the history of it. As you look at the results from yesterday, and obviously we're going to have an extremely contentious presidential election in 2 years, how much do you see the disenfranchisement of voters being front of mind in that? Because obviously, the various local rules that are put in place to kind of put obstacles in front of you getting to the polls can influence results. Is that something that you think that Democrats should be focusing on in the next 2 years? Do you think there's been enough of a focus on making sure that everybody's empowered to bring their vote?
No, I don't think there's been enough focus in making sure that everyone's been empowered to free and fair vote. People always talk about Stacey Abrams like she's Superwoman, and there's a way in which I 100% understand that. But actually, what Stacey Abrams is an heir to the civil rights era organizers who went into getting people to think of visions of freedom and liberation through voter registration and voter education, but that was kind of on the path to a bigger goal, right? Like that was the most beautiful thing of the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, SNCC, and sort of influenced by the sort of wonderful Democratic strategist Ella Baker, right? Like Stacey Abrams is building on a tradition that brought dramatic change to American democracy and to some extent to the Democratic Party. And then national leadership within the Democratic Party. I mean, LBJ was resisting that even in the in the midst of it, because he was such a good manipulator of the Senate. But they didn't learn the lesson of spade work and grassroots organizing, and every time it pays dividends, even the Democratic leadership acts shocked by it and takes the wrong takeaway, right? So Obama did the same thing in 2008, and their response was, let's go find some charismatic Black people. Sure, I love charismatic Black people. But that's not what made the difference in that election. It was Obama's sort of folks on the ground, understanding that connecting with people and getting them to articulate their own interests was the path forward to victory. And until Democrats can figure out democracy, like, they're always gonna be on the defensive.
My turnout and mobilization is absolutely essential. I think in the South especially, that Democrats, I was speaking directly in North Carolina, we're gonna have to, Democrats will have to go beyond turnout and mobilization. What's happening is that there is not enough of a democratic political culture in too many parts of the state. And the idea that we're gonna go out in the last month and go get our voters, which is really important, is gonna be enough, is proving now for 30 years not to be enough. And you can argue that the mobilization should be done better, and it should, and turnout should be more effective, and it should. But there's still a larger problem that if you think that you're gonna go get your voters in the last month, things are already decided in many, many respects. So I think the Democrats have to look at a lot of these beachheads, havens, enclaves throughout the state, and supporting people running for city council, people running for state legislatures, and building, not just going to get voters, which is absolutely essential, but going beyond that and starting to have real democratic political cultures where people can win city council. People forget in North Carolina, there's a Democratic mayor in Gaston, North Carolina. There's a Democratic mayor in Beaufort. There's a Democratic mayor in, in a number of places in Sanford, North Carolina. But those counties just are so red. So turning out voters is really important, but I think we're gonna have to start thinking about a new generation of leadership and Democrats supporting, getting supported by state and national figures, not just in terms of mobilization, but actually creating a new generation of political leadership throughout the states, especially in the southern states.
I think we're saying the same thing, but I think small d democratic culture, not just big D democratic.
Well, yeah, I mean, for a Democratic Party, they better think of ways to connect with people so that the Democratic Party has some existence in some of these places that it doesn't. But that depends on probably having a little D democratic culture at the bottom, yeah.
Thank you both. We're going to wrap up the Zoom portion in a minute so we can get some more questions in from everybody in the room. But before we do, Professor Haney, you mentioned polling earlier, and polling's reputation in general took a beat during 2016 and 2020 when it didn't necessarily indicate what was happening. Do you have any sense whether polling has kind of bounced back and actually provided us with any insight into what was going to happen in this election, or is the polling industry in general really got to look at itself and figure out whether it needs to fundamentally change how it's trying to engage people's teams?
So that's an interesting question. So let me say, I don't think that polling missed so badly in 2015 and 20. I mean, it was the interpretation of the polls in many instances, how the media reported what the polls actually told us, and over-reported or misreported what the most reputable polls showed. So the polls haven't missed so baddy if you look at the margins of errors and you incorporate that in the analysis. But the point I was making earlier about the polls that's worrisome, and Asher alluded to this as well, that there's so many, and they flood the airwaves in the last stages of the campaign. I don't believe they're all legitimate polls. I think that's what all this push poll effect that's going to take, right, is to sway voters with sort of false information, to sway the electorate by just releasing a bunch of stuff out there, to sort of set a tone, to encourage people to vote or to suppress vote by thinking, well, I'm so far behind, it's no need for me, my candidate's going to lose. I just saw these polls, there's no need for me to go vote, or I need a Russian vote. So I just don't believe all of the polls that are out there. I think it requires some careful analysis as to what these polls are saying, who the polls, what they ask, how they ask, what conclusions they draw and what scientific basis they draw those conclusions. It behooves journalists to be careful in reporting.
Gotcha, thank you. Professor McLaughlin, I wanted to ask you this. We've had a number of people asking specifically, what do you think were the factors that played into Sherry Beasley's defeat, Ted Budd's victory? And the same for the Bo Hines and Wiley Nickel races. Do you think there were specific factors that applied there that didn't apply in other races?
No, I think that Sherry Beasley, I think in many respects, their campaigns can always be criticized, but I think she ran a good campaign in North Carolina. There is not a clear big D Democratic majority, especially in a year where, unless it's 2008, where it's a good national year. So I think she was more the victim of national conditioning. She also was running against Ted Budd. As I've said to some reporters, Ted Budd tried to act like Richard Burr's fraternity brother in many respects. Recede into the wall, don't be crazy, be for Trump, but try to keep that under wraps. And he succeeded at that. So you can always make criticisms or say there are different factors. But when I look at the numbers, the Sherry Beasley Budd race very much like the Donald Trump, Joe Biden race in North Carolina with some adjustments downward. And not much difference. So I would not get into what goes wrong with Sherry Beasley. The interesting thing about the Nickel race, as far as I can tell, the Republicans were, Hines was getting the kind of Republican vote that Republicans usually get in Republican areas, but Nickel got a really strong vote from Wake County. So again, it was a little bit of how the district was designed. Again, there could be criticisms back and forth. I will say this way. I'll say this about Nickel. Nickel was lucky to be running against a young, inexperienced person who, unlike Budd, did not recede into the wall, who did act like he was the next coming of Madison Cawthorn, and then realized, oh, I better not do that. I need to modulate. And it was probably too late for Hines. But in the case of Beasley Budd, I would not get into many detailed criticisms of the Beasley campaign and see it more as a function of that.
I actually think there's a positive message coming out of for the Democrats coming out of the Beasley Budd race. Again, who would have predicted that we'd be talking about and watching North Carolina in the last weeks of this campaign in a national sense? The margin of victory of Budd is, I think, 4 percentage points. That's a close race, especially in the context of this midterm election where Republicans have a tremendous advantage. So I think there's some lessons to be learned by Democrats looking at what Beasley did and how she did it. She contoured her campaign to fit the state in which she was running. She didn't run like a Stacey Abrams or a Mandela Barnes. She ran like a Sherry Beasley in North Carolina. And there's a lesson to be learned in that. And those results, I think, bear that out if the Democrats look at the results carefully and not focus on the defeat because it's better.
Yeah, she ran who she was.
Ran who she was.
She was doing this.
Yeah,
Right. I think it's a positive message coming out as the Democrats go forward.
Thank you all for that analysis. We'll wrap up the Zoom portion a bit early, so if any of you want to do one-on-one interviews, you can. Does anybody have questions for the panel?
Yeah, I have a quick question regarding the foreign policy. In case Republicans win these elections, how do you think it's going to affect foreign policy? There's going to be a big change, right?
Asher can answer.
It is a big question, and I find it hard to generalize across foreign policy because there are some areas of current foreign policy, for example, U.S. policy toward China, that for good or for bad, there's relative bipartisan agreement. There are other areas where it breaks down, and I think the big looming question is implications for the conflict in Ukraine and potential negotiations with Russia. I don't want to overstate that because while there's, I think, greater diversity of views on that among Republicans, in other words, more support for Russia among and for more sympathy towards Russia among Republicans. That's not evident in all Republican elites, and won't necessarily translate into, it wouldn't necessarily translate into, say, a more favorable outcome. I've been personally very encouraged and a little bit surprised by how overwhelming the public support for Ukraine in this among Americans has been in this conflict. But I do think, and I think that you know, the facts on the ground could determine that one. I called this morning Russia withdrawing from key positions, and so if the conflict starts turning in different ways, that could impact. But I think that's the one area where you could see some divisions with Republicans favoring a
What
more
about Iran as well?
accommodating position. Iran as well, of course, until recently, a lot of the debate over Iran surrounded the nuclear agreement, and it's still the official position of President Biden, of Democrats in Congress, most Democrats in Congress, that we should renegotiate, re-enter that agreement. A Republican majority in the House will complicate that. I don't know how likely it is to begin with, but of course now on top of that, you have debate over human rights and how much accountability the United States and other governments should hold for the human rights violations, the latest round of human rights violations in Iran, and just the overwhelming show of support or of opposition to the Iranian regime. And so I don't know how much that changes, how much official policy changes. It probably becomes a little less likely that a nuclear deal is negotiated, but again, I'm not sure how likely that is.
I read here that House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said that he may block further defense and humanitarian aid to Ukraine if he becomes Speaker of the House next year.
Yeah, so that's really the main one where I think there could be a big difference.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Eliko from Hungary. So I can definitely see the same patterns happening here in the US as in my country. My question is that there was a lot of talk before the midterms about how polarized the US campaign became and how people talk about the other party. Do you think how do you think it affected the election? Do you see this polarization had some effect that how many people went to vote because they thought that the other party is trying to attack democracy or they're trying to attack freedom?
I can add. but-
Yeah, well, the polarization and what people Carrie and his colleague might refer to as negative polarization is alive and well, and certainly in North Carolina politics, where you're having races, the top of the ticket really determines what's happening at the bottom of the race. The one contrast is with some of these states where you had candidates who were so extreme in people's viewpoint that split ticket voting did really matter, which maybe is refreshing to a lot of people. But it's only important because they're so few and so precious that they make a difference. So, I'll let others speak about more than North Carolina, but North Carolina and polarization definitely alive and well.
Yeah, so what, this is just a speculation on my part, on what basis is there polarization, right? Because over policy, that's one thing, and then we polarize over stances on policy. But what since the Trump election in the previous, 4 or 5, 6 years, there's been a polarization about just, what's right and wrong, what's true and not true, right? That may dissipate, given, the election of last night results. And I think as we move farther and farther away from the Trump year, that you might see that type of polarization or sort of common sense, whether there was fraud in the election, Trump election. I think voters will gravitate back towards a more normal polarization, if that makes sense. That's just a feeling that I have, right? That the polarization, the basis of it has shifted over time. And we're in a place now where it's sort of unrecognizable, inexplicable, as a social scientist trying to understand it. Sort of like black and white, night and day, and expose it, to any of us.
I mean, so I'm, historian is somewhere between the social sciences and the humanities, which means I spend a lot of time thinking about language. And I'm not even remotely satisfied with the language of polarization to describe the kinds of disagreement that we see right now, right? Polarization implies two equal and opposite sides where the validity probably lies exactly in the middle. But we know if we look at kind of places across other countries beyond America, or if we look at America in different moments, you compare the American political spectrum in 1912, or even 1948, or possibly 64, I don't know, but I think 12 and 48, because there were elections with multiple parties, to now, that there's not, like, America doesn't have a vibrant left in the way that it used to, or in the way that other countries do. So when you talk about a far right, but you have a center left, right? Where's the middle? You know what I mean, right? And so I don't know that I'm helping your question. I'm just doing what academics do, which is to complicate it. But I wish that we wouldn't fall into the same shorthand that we always use, assuming that the meaning behind it is robust.
Yes, sir.
I think I've listened a lot and had the Republican as well, the Democrat music. I mean, where the people located in all this debate about election? Because I've not had you talk about the people that won by making this decision, and this is going to help America. And secondly, we've been talking about Trump, that this could be the Waterloo for Trump. But Biden is pretty old. And if he was in Africa, you would be saying that Africans are elective Gregorians, old people and stuff like that. But you seem to be supporting Trump. I mean, they seem to be Biden election. How far is his age going to affect you in 2024?
And Trump is no spring chicken himself.
Yes.
So I will say, I think we've been focusing on the candidate, but we've been talking about the people, right? Because one reason this election is not a typical midterm election is because of the people who actually showed up and voted. So it's the people who've spoken, and we're trying to make some sense out of what they said in the context of a large set of patterns that we historically see. So we have been talking about the people indirectly because what we're talking about is exactly what the people did, and what the polls suggested something different. Pundits and talking heads suggested something different. The people actually spoke last night, and we're trying to make sense out of exactly what they said. And for Biden, so Biden's older. But I suspect, and I think if you look at the outcome of the elections last night, he went out in some key states. I think he, called candidates in those states. I think he, given who he is and given the older statesman status, was a benefit to the Democratic Party in 2020. I don't know who else could have won. Other than someone like Biden, who was stable, and what you see is what you get, and you know what you're getting, but it's always been Joe. That may be the case in 2024, depending on what happens on the Republican side, which I suspect is going to be a bloodbath, like one we haven't seen before, if it's DeSantis and Trump vying for the nomination. And that may create so much turmoil that the country may want steady Joe again to come and just calm. There's been a lot of turmoil and people want calm and retired. And so that may benefit someone who's an elder statesman like Joe Biden. Having said that, I don't think he's running.
I was just gonna add briefly, I take a slightly different view, only that I think one difference between the two parties right now is that whereas for the time being, Ron DeSantis is sort of the main potential rival to Trump. I don't think that there is a single main rival to Biden. And that's not because even Democratic voters overwhelmingly support Biden. In exit polls yesterday and in previous polls, a majority of Democrats think that Biden should not run again, in part because of his age. On the other hand, if you look at how Biden won the presidency in 2020, by winning Sunbelt states like Arizona and Georgia, but also winning just enough of the so-called Rust Belt states, putting Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania back in the Democratic column. A lot of Democrats look around the field and say, is there anybody else who could assemble that same coalition that Biden could? And you never know until you're there, right? Many would say, yes, there is, and they could name the names of who those people would be. But I think there's a lot of anxiety about the fact that Biden is this bridge from the past to the future, who is sort of uniquely capable of rising to the occasion that this moment called for within the Democratic Party. And there's a lot of anxiety about who else could do that if Biden's not in the scene.
And I would just ask this question about kind of where are the people in this conversation? And I think the conversation that Mac and I were having about sort of, in my case, small d Democratic political culture, and my invoking the example of Smith and that kind of like on the ground grassroots organizing, that the people haven't won just because someone got elected, right? The people have won when they are able to participate in the electoral process in such a way that they can articulate needs and have them heard and responded to, right? So the electing is only part of it. It's the whole sort of kit and caboodle. It's getting folks to engage in the debate. It's getting folks to envision like the leaders, encouraging others to run or run themselves. So when I talk about yesterday's election and sort of think about it, I'm not necessarily thinking about any one moment. I'm thinking about yesterday's election as part of a broader kind of a process of encouraging folks on the ground to find their voice. So it's kind of like, how do you think about the interplay between high politics and social movements, and how social movements can interact with political structures to produce change, always with people as the agents, right? Sort of people's agency shaping structure. What on earth happens in 2024? Lord, that's for somebody else to talk about.
Real quick, just from the North Carolina perspective, speaking about the people, the biggest voting block in North Carolina is registered unaffiliated, more than Republican and Democrats, 36% registered unaffiliated. In all this kind of talk that we've been talking about Republicans and Democrats being polarized, or we need a better definition of that. Part of that definition is lots of people are opting out, want to opt out of this battle that the Democrats and Republicans seem to be, this death march that they seem to be involved in. And it's not showing up in North Carolina yet in terms of any kind of organized political force. But I think both parties need to be very worried, because I think you probably see an increase in independents in North Carolina, or unaffiliated, after the 2022 cycle. In some way or another, that is a fragmentary evidence that people are getting left out of the process of Republicans and Democrats having this kind of death march fight. So.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, my name is Mauricio from El Salvador. In my country, I come from a Central American country, and I saw some situations for example, in Nicaragua, when the Presidente Arnoldo Alemán breaks the right in two parts. In El Salvador happens with Tony Saca. He breaks the official party in two parts, and the rights go out. Do you think Donald Trump wants to DeSantis about stop, I'm going for the president, not you. This will be a issue for Republican Party. The Republican Party can be break. If it doesn't break, the people, maybe it's bad with Trump and happy with Santis and somebody here and somebody here. And this is a win for the Democrats in 2024. Do you think about that?
I'll just say, I think about that, and I think the sort of division of the Republican Party into a Trump faction and a DeSantis faction that is sort of this knockdown, drag out fight in 2024, in my view, is probably a best case scenario for big D Democrats, and in some ways a best case scenario for small d democracy insofar as it allows pro-democratic forces to consolidate, perhaps win congressional majorities that they can enact new laws with, but also perhaps create space for another political alignment that would be a sort of conservative but pro-democratic force, right, which we do not have in this country right now. So I think it's a best case scenario. Do I think it's likely to happen? I'm not so sure, because I think right now the forces are still, the incentives are still such that either Donald Trump comes out of the picture because he's indicted or something like that, and that paves the way for DeSantis, or Donald Trump charges ahead carrying his followers with him, and DeSantis at some point decides it's not worth the political price that he would pay to take him on head first. And so there's a scenario where DeSantis is strong and Trump is weaker, and a scenario where Trump is stronger and DeSantis is weaker. And I think the scenario you're talking about requires them both to be kind of equally powerful within the Republican Party, and it's hard to see that equilibrium being maintained. And so we'll see.
Let me just ask you this, that I think it would be good for the Republican Party to have this battle. It's already happening beneath the surface, right? You have a internal civil war in the party. I think the state of the Republican Party, they need to have it all out, even if it costs them an election in the next cycle. If they don't solve this issue or figure out where the party is going, they're going to stay a party. It's going to continue to cost them elections up and down the ticket in multiple cycles. It may not be Trump and there are others out there who are willing to have this battle with Trump. A former governor of New Jersey is one who's waiting in the wings and maybe running. Or Mike Pompeo, there are others around who may be willing to have this battle with Trump, and it may be something that's necessary to actually save the Republican Party, maybe good for the Republican Party to have it out sooner than later.
If anybody else has a question, we can ask. If not, we can wrap up. And then if anybody has one-on-one questions, we can do that. Those who raise hands. So thank you, everybody who joined us on Zoom and YouTube. We're going to call it there. Thank you to our panelists, Adrian Len Smith, Kerry Haney, Ashley Goldstein, and Matt McCall for providing your expertise and opinions. Those of you online, if you wish to join future briefings, email us at dukenews@duke.edu, or if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. That concludes the Zoom event. Thank you all very much for joining us.